Blind Willow, Sleeping Woman. When I closed my eyes, the scent of the wind wafted up toward me. A May wind, swelling up like a piece of fruit, with a rough outer skin, slimy flesh, dozens of seeds. The flesh split open in midair, spraying seeds like gentle buckshot into the bare skin of my arms, leaving behind a faint trace of pain. "What time is it?" my cousin asked me. About 8 inches shorter than me, he had to look up when he talked. I glanced at my watch. 10:20. "Does that watch tell good time?" "Yeah, I think so." My cousin grabbed my wrist to look at the watch. His slim, smooth fingers were surprisingly strong. "Did it cost a lot?" "No, it's pretty cheap," I said, glancing again at the timetable. No response. My cousin looked confused. The white teeth between his parted lips looked like bones that had atrophied. "It's pretty cheap," I said, looking right at him, carefully repeating the words. "It's pretty cheap, but it keeps good time." My cousin nodded silently. My cousin can't hear well out of his right ear. Soon after he went into elementary school, he was hit by a baseball and it screwed up his hearing. That doesn't keep him from functioning normally most of the time. He attends a regular school, leads an entirely normal life. In his classroom, he always sits in the front row, on the right, so he can keep his left ear toward the teacher. And his grades aren't so bad. The thing is, though, he goes through periods when he can hear sounds pretty well, and periods when he can't. It's cyclical, like the tides. And sometimes, maybe twice a year, he can barely hear anything out of either ear. It's like the silence in his right ear deepens to the point where it crushes out any sound on the left side. When that happens, ordinary life goes out the window and he has to take some time off from school. The doctors are basically stumped. They've never seen a case like it, so there's nothing they can do. Just because a watch is expensive doesn't mean it's accurate, my cousin said, as if trying to convince himself. I used to have a pretty expensive watch, but it was always off. I got it when I started junior high, but I lost it a year later. Since then I've gone without a watch. They won't buy me a new one. Must be tough to get along without one, I said. What? He asked. Isn't it hard to get along without a watch? I repeated, looking right at him. No, it isn't, he replied, shaking his head. It's not like I'm living off in the mountains or something. If I want to know the time I just ask somebody. True enough, I said. We were silent again for a while. I knew I should say something more, try to be kind to him, try to make him relax a little until we arrived at the hospital. But it had been 5 years since I saw him last. In the meanwhile he'd grown from 9 to 14, and I'd gone from 20 to 25. And that span of time had created a translucent barrier between us that was hard to traverse. Even when I had to say something, the right words just wouldn't come out. And every time I hesitated, every time I swallowed back something I was about to say, my cousin looked at me with a slightly confused look on his face. His left ear tilted ever so slightly toward me. What time is it now? He asked me. 10:29, I replied. It was 10:32 when the bus finally rolled into view. The bus that came was a new type, not like the one I used to take to high school. The windshield in front of the driver was much bigger, the whole vehicle like some huge bomber minus the wings. And the bus was more crowded than I'd imagined. Nobody was standing in the aisle, but we couldn't sit together. We weren't going very far, so we stood next to the rear door in back. Why the bus should be so crowded at this time of day was a mystery. The bus route started from a private railway station, continued up into a residential area in the hills, then circled back to the station, and there weren't any tourist spots along the way. A few schools along the route made the buses crowded when kids were going to school, but at this time of day the bus should have been empty. My cousin and I held on to the straps and poles. The bus was brand new, straight from the factory, the metal surfaces so shiny you could see your face reflected in them. The nap of the seats was all fluffy, and even the tiniest of screws had that proud, expectant feeling that only brand new machinery possesses. The new bus, and the way it was unexpectedly crowded, threw me off. Maybe the bus route had changed since I last rode it. I looked carefully around the bus and glanced outside. But it was the same old view of a quiet residential district I remembered well. "This is the right bus, isn't it?" my cousin asked worriedly. Ever since we got aboard I must have had a perplexed look on my face. "Not to worry," I said, trying to reassure myself as much as him. "There's only one bus route that goes by here, so this has got to be it." "Did you used to take this bus when you went to high school?" my cousin asked. "Yeah, that's right." "Did you like school?" "Not particularly," I said. "But I could see my friends there, and it wasn't such a long ride." My cousin thought about what I'd said. "Do you still see them?" "No, not for a long time," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Why not?" "Why don't you see them?" "'Cause we live so far away from each other." That wasn't the reason. But I couldn't think of any other way to explain it. Right beside me sat a group of old people. Must have been close to 15 of them. They were the reason the bus was crowded, I suddenly realized. They were all suntanned, even the backs of their necks dark. And every single one of them was skinny. Most of the men had on thick mountain climbing types of shirts, the women, simple, unadorned blouses. All of them had small rucksacks in their laps, the kind you'd use for short hikes into the hills. It was amazing how much they looked alike. Like a drawer full of samples of something, all neatly lined up. The strange thing, though, was that there wasn't any mountain climbing route along this bus line. So where in the world could they have been going? I thought about this as I stood there, clinging to the strap, but no plausible explanation came to mind. "I wonder if it's going to hurt this time, the treatments?" my cousin asked me. "I don't know," I said. "I didn't hear any of the details." "Have you ever been to an ear doctor?" I shook my head. I hadn't been to an ear doctor once in my life. "Has it hurt before?" I asked. "Not really," my cousin said glumly. "It wasn't totally painless, of course, sometimes it hurt a little. But nothing terrible. Maybe this time it'll be the same." "Your mom said they're not going to do anything much different from usual." "But if they do the same as always, how's that going to help?" "Well, you never know. Sometimes the unexpected happens." "You mean like pulling out a cork?" my cousin said. I glanced at him, but didn't detect any sarcasm. "It'll feel different having a new doctor treat you, and sometimes just a slight change in procedure might make all the difference." "I wouldn't give up so easily." "I'm not giving up," my cousin said. "But you are kind of fed up with it." "I guess," he said, and sighed. "The fear is the worst thing. The pain I imagine is worse than the actual pain. Know what I mean?" "Yeah, I know." A lot of things had happened that spring. A situation developed at work and I ended up quitting my job at a little advertising firm in Tokyo where I'd been working for 2 years. Around the same time I broke up with my girlfriend. We'd been going out since college. A month after that my grandmother died of intestinal cancer, and for the first time in 5 years I came back to this town, small suitcase in hand. My old room was just as I'd left it. The books I'd read were still on the shelf, my bed was still there, my desk, and all the old records I used to listen to. But everything in the room had dried up, had long ago lost its color and smell. Time alone had stood still. I'd planned to go back to Tokyo a couple of days after my grandmother's funeral to run down some leads for a new job. I was planning to move to a new apartment, too. I needed a change of scenery. As the days passed, though, it seemed like too much trouble to get off my butt and get going. To put a finer point on it, even if I'd wanted to get up and get going, I couldn't. I spent my time holed up in my old room, listening to those records. Rereading old books, occasionally doing a little weeding in the garden. I didn't meet anybody, and the only people I talked to were members of my family. One day my aunt dropped by and asked me to take my cousin to a new hospital. She should take him herself, she said, but something had come up on the day of the appointment and she couldn't. The hospital was near my old high school, so I knew where it was, and since I had nothing else going on, I couldn't very well refuse. My aunt handed me an envelope with some cash in it for us to use as lunch money. This switch to a new hospital came about because the treatment he'd been getting at his old hospital hadn't done a thing to help. In fact, he was having more problems than ever. When my aunt complained to the doctor in charge, he suggested that the problem had more to do with the boy's home environment than anything medical, and the two of them went at it. Not that anybody really expected that changing hospitals would lead to a quick improvement in his hearing. Nobody said as much, but they'd pretty much given up hope that his condition would ever improve. My cousin lived nearby, but I was just over a decade older than him and we had never been what you'd call close. When the relatives got together I might take him someplace or play with him, but that was the extent of it. Still, before long everyone started to look at my cousin and me as a pair, thinking that he was attached to me and that he was my favorite. For the longest time I couldn't figure out why. Now, though, seeing the way he tilted his head, his left ear aimed at me, I found it strangely touching. Like the sound of rain heard long ago, his awkwardness struck a chord with me. And I began to catch a glimpse of why our relatives wanted to bring us together. The bus had passed by 7 or 8 bus stops when my cousin anxiously looked up at me again. "Is it much farther?" "Yeah, we still have a ways. It's a big hospital, so we won't miss it." I casually watched as the wind from the open window gently rustled the brims of the old people's hats and the scarves around their necks. Who were these people? And where could they possibly be headed? "Hey, are you going to work in my father's company?" my cousin asked. I looked at him in surprise. His father, my uncle, ran a large printing company in Kobe. I'd never given the idea a thought, and nobody ever dropped a hint. "Nobody said anything about that," I said. "Why do you ask?" My cousin blushed. "I just thought you might be," he said. "But why? Don't you? You wouldn't have to leave. And everybody'd be happy." The taped message announced the next stop, but no one pushed the button to get off. Nobody was waiting to get on at the bus stop either. "But there's stuff I have to do, so I have to go back to Tokyo," I said. My cousin nodded silently. There wasn't a single thing I had to do. But I couldn't very well stay here. The number of houses thinned out as the bus climbed the mountain slope. Thick branches began to throw a heavy shadow across the road. We passed by some foreign-looking houses, painted, with low walls in front. The cold breeze felt good. Each time the bus rounded a curve the sea down below popped into view, then disappeared. Until the bus pulled up at the hospital my cousin and I just stood there, watching the scenery go by. "The examination will take some time and I can handle it alone," my cousin said, "so why don't you go and wait for me somewhere?" After a quick hello to the doctor, I exited the exam room and went to the cafeteria. I'd barely had a bite for breakfast and was starving, but nothing on the menu whetted my appetite. I made do with a cup of coffee. It was a weekday morning and one little family and I had the place to ourselves. The father was in his mid-40s, wearing a navy blue striped pair of pajamas and plastic slippers. The mother and little twin girls had come to pay a visit. The twins had on identical white dresses and were bent over the table, serious looks on their faces, drinking glasses of orange juice. The father's injury, or illness, didn't seem too serious, and both parents and kids looked bored. Outside the window was a lawn. A sprinkler ticked as it rotated, misting the grass with a silvery spray. A pair of shrill long-tailed birds cut right above the sprinkler and disappeared from sight. Past the lawn there were a few deserted tennis courts, the nets gone. Beyond the tennis courts was a line of zelkovas, and between their branches you could glimpse the ocean. The early summer sun glinted here and there off the small waves. The breeze rustled the new leaves of the zelkovas, ever so slightly bending the spray from the sprinkler. I felt like I'd seen this scene, many years before. A broad swatch of lawn, twin girls slurping up orange juice, long-tailed birds flying off who knows where, netless tennis courts, the sea beyond, but it was an illusion. It was vivid enough, an intense sense of the real, but an illusion nonetheless. I'd never been to this hospital in my life. I stretched my legs out on the seat opposite, took a deep breath, and closed my eyes. In the darkness I could see a lump of white. Silently it expanded, then contracted, like a microbe under a microscope. Changing form, spreading out, breaking up, reforming. It was 8 years ago when I went to that other hospital. A small hospital next to the sea. All you could see out the window were some oleanders. It was a hospital, and it smelled of rain. My friend's girlfriend had her chest operated on there, and the two of us went to see how she was doing. The summer of our junior year in high school. It wasn't much of an operation, really, just done to correct the position of one of her ribs that curved inward a bit. Not an emergency procedure, just the type of thing that would eventually have to be done, so she figured why not take care of it now. The operation itself was over quickly, but they wanted her to take her time recuperating, so she stayed in the hospital for 10 days. My friend and I rode there together on a 125 cubic centimeters Yamaha motorcycle. He drove on the way there, I drove on the way back. He'd asked me to come. "No way I'm going to a hospital by myself," he'd said. My friend stopped at a candy store near the station and bought a box of chocolates. I held on to his belt with one hand, the other hand clutching tightly the box of chocolates. It was a hot day and our shirts kept getting soaked, then drying in the wind. As my friend drove he sang some nothing song in an awful voice. I can still remember the smell of his sweat. Not too long after that he died. His girlfriend had on blue pajamas and a thin gown sort of thing down to her knees. The three of us sat at a table in the cafeteria, smoked short hope cigarettes, drank cokes, and ate ice cream. She was starving and ate 2 sugar-coated donuts and drank cocoa with tons of cream in it. Still that didn't seem enough for her. "By the time you get out of here you're going to be a regular blimp," my friend said, somewhat disgustedly. "It's okay, I'm recovering," she replied, wiping the tips of her fingers, covered in oil from the donuts. As they talked I glanced out the window at the oleanders. They were huge, almost like a forest unto themselves. I could hear the sound of waves too. The railing next to the window was completely rusted from the constant breeze. An antique-looking ceiling fan nudged the hot, sticky air around the room. The cafeteria had the smell of a hospital. Even the food and drinks had that hospital odor to them. The girlfriend's pajamas had 2 breast pockets, in one of which was a small gold-colored pen. Whenever she leaned forward I could see her small, white breasts peep out of the V-neck collar. The memories ground to a halt right there. I tried to remember what had happened after that. I drank a Coke, gazed at the oleanders, snuck a peek at her breasts, and then what? I shifted in the plastic chair and, resting my head in my hands, tried to dig down further in the layers of memory. Like gouging out a cork with the tip of a thin-bladed knife. I looked off to one side and tried to visualize the doctors splitting open the flesh of her chest, sticking their rubber-gloved hands inside to straighten out her crooked rib. But it all seemed too surreal, like some sort of allegory. That's right, after that we talked about sex. At least my friend did. But what did he say? Something about me, no doubt. How I'd tried, unsuccessfully, to make it with a girl. Not much of a story, but the way he told it, blowing everything out of proportion, made his girlfriend burst out laughing. Made me laugh as well. The guy really knew how to tell a story. Please don't make me laugh, she said, a bit painfully. My chest hurts when I laugh. Where does it hurt? My friend asked. She pressed a spot on her pajamas above her heart, just to the right of her left breast. He made some joke about that, and she laughed again. I looked at my watch. It was 11:45, but my cousin still wasn't back. It was getting close to lunchtime and the cafeteria was starting to get more crowded. All sorts of sounds and voices mixed together like smoke enveloping the room. I returned once more to the realm of memory. And that small gold pen she had in her breast pocket. Now I remember, she used that pen to write something on a paper. Napkin. She was drawing a picture. The napkin was too soft and the tip of her pen kept getting stuck. Still, she managed to draw a hill. And a small house on top of the hill. A woman was asleep in the house. The house was surrounded by a stand of blind willows. It was the blind willows that had put her to sleep. What the heck's a blind willow? My friend asked. There is a kind of tree like that. Well, I never heard of it. That's 'cause I'm the one who created it, she said, smiling. Blind. Willows have a lot of pollen, and tiny flies covered with the stuff crawled inside her ear and put the woman to sleep. She took a new napkin and drew a picture of the blind willow. The blind willow turned out to be a tree the size of an azalea. The tree was in bloom, the flowers surrounded by dark green leaves like a bunch of lizard tails gathered in a bunch. The blind willow didn't resemble a willow at all. You got a cigarette? My friend asked me. I tossed a sweaty pack of hopes and some matches across the table. A blind willow looks small on the outside, but it's got incredibly deep roots, she explained. Actually, after a certain point it stops growing up and pushes further and further down into the ground. Like the darkness nourishes it. And the flies carry that pollen to her ear, burrow inside, and put her to sleep, my friend added, struggling to light his cigarette with the damp matches. But what happens to the flies? They stay inside the woman and eat her flesh, naturally, his girlfriend said. Gobble it up, my friend said. I remembered now how that summer she'd written a long poem about the blind willow and explained it all to us. That was the only homework assignment she did that summer. She made up a story based on a dream she'd had one night, and as she lay in bed for a week she wrote this long poem. My friend said he wanted to read it, but she was still revising it, so she turned him down. Instead, she drew those pictures and summarized the plot. A young man climbed up the hill to rescue the woman the blind willow pollen had put to sleep. That's got to be me, my friend said. She shook her head. No, it isn't you. You sure? He asked. I'm sure, she said, a fairly serious look on her face. I don't know why. I know that. But I do. You're not angry, are you? You bet I am, my friend frowned, half joking. Pushing his way through the thick blind willows, the young man slowly made his way up the hill. He was the first one ever to climb the hill once the blind willows took over. Hat pulled down over his eyes, brushing away with one hand the swarms of flies buzzing around him, the young man kept climbing. To see the sleeping woman. To wake her from her long, deep sleep. But by the time he reached the top of the hill, the woman's body had basically been eaten up already by the flies, right? My friend said. In a sense, his girlfriend replied. In a sense, being eaten by flies makes it a sad story, doesn't it? My friend said. Yes, I guess so, she said after giving it some thought. What do you think? She asked me. Sounds like a sad story to me, I replied. It was 12:20 when my cousin came back. He was carrying a small bag of medicine and had a sort of unfocused look on his face. After he appeared at the entrance to the cafeteria, it took some time for him to spot me and come on over. He walked awkwardly, as if he couldn't keep his balance. He sat down across from me and, like he'd been too busy to remember to breathe, took a huge breath. How'd it go? I asked. He said. I waited for him to say more, but he didn't. Are you hungry? I asked. He nodded silently. You want to eat here? Or do you want to take the bus into town and eat there? He looked uncertainly around the room. Here's fine, he said. I bought lunch tickets and ordered the set lunches for both of us. Until the food was brought over to us, my cousin gazed silently out the window at the same scenery I'd been looking at, the sea, the row of Zelkovas, the sprinkler. At the table beside us, a nicely decked-out middle-aged couple were eating sandwiches and talking about a friend of theirs who had lung cancer. How he'd quit smoking 5 years ago, but it was too late, how he'd vomit blood when he woke up in the morning. The wife asked the questions, the husband gave the answers. In a certain sense, the husband explained, you can see a person's whole life in the cancer they get. Our lunches consisted of Salisbury steaks and fried whitefish, salad and rolls. We sat there, across from each other, silently eating. The whole time we were eating, the couple next to us droned on and on about how cancer starts, why the cancer rate's gone up, why there isn't any medicine to combat it. Everywhere you go it's the same, my cousin said in a flat tone, gazing at his hands. The same old questions, the same tests. We were sitting on a bench in front of the hospital, waiting for the bus. Every once in a while the breeze would rustle the green leaves above us. Sometimes you can't hear anything at all. I asked him. That's right, my cousin answered. I can't hear a thing. What does that feel like? He tilted his head to one side and thought about it. All of a sudden you can't hear anything. But it takes a while before you realize what's happened. By then you can't hear a thing. It's like you're at the bottom of the sea wearing earplugs. That continues for a while. All the time you can't hear a thing, but it's not just your ears. Not being able to hear anything is just part of it. Does it bother you? He shook his head, a short, definite shake. I don't know why, but it doesn't bother me that much. It is inconvenient, though. Not being able to hear anything. I tried to picture it, but the image wouldn't come. Did you ever see John Ford's movie Fort Apache? My cousin asked. A long time ago, I said. It was on TV recently. It's really a good movie. I affirmed. In the beginning of the movie there's this new colonel who's come to a fort out west. A veteran captain comes out to meet him when he arrives. The captain's played by John Wayne. The colonel doesn't know much about what things are like in the West. And there's an Indian uprising all around the fort. My cousin took a neatly folded white handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his mouth. Once he gets to the fort the colonel turns to John Wayne and says, I did see a few Indians on the way over here. And John Wayne, with this cool look on his face, replies, don't worry. If you were able to spot some Indians, that means there aren't any there. I don't remember the actual lines, but it went something like that. Do you get what he means? I couldn't recall any lines like that from Fort Apache. It struck me as a little abstruse for a John Ford movie. But it had been a while since I'd seen the film. I think it means that what can be seen by anybody isn't all that important, I guess. My cousin frowned. I don't really get it either, but every time somebody sympathizes with me about my ears, that line comes to me. If you were able to spot some Indians, that means there aren't any there. I laughed. Is that strange? My cousin asked. Yep, I laughed. And he laughed. It had been a long time since I'd seen him laugh. After a while my cousin said, like he was unburdening himself, "Would you look inside my ears for me?" Look inside your ears? I asked, a little surprised. Just what you can see from the outside. Okay, but why do you want me to do that? I don't know, my cousin blushed. I just want you to see what they look like. Okay, I said. I'll give it a whirl. My cousin sat facing away from me, tilting his right ear toward me. He had a really nicely shaped ear. It was on the small side, but the earlobe was all puffy, like a freshly baked Madeleine. I'd never looked at anybody's ear so intently before. Once you start observing it closely, the human ear, its structure, is a pretty mysterious thing. With all these absurd twists and turns to it, bumps and depressions. Maybe evolution determined this weird shape was the optimum way to collect sounds, or to protect what's inside. Surrounded by this asymmetrical wall, the whole of the ear gapes open like the entrance to a dark, secret cave. I pictured my friend's girlfriend, microscopic flies nesting in her ear. Sweet pollen stuck to their tiny legs, they burrow into the warm darkness inside her, sucking up all the juices, laying tiny eggs inside her brain. But you can't see them, or even hear the sound of their wings. That's enough, my cousin said. He spun around to sit facing forward, shifting around on the bench. So, see anything unusual? Nothing different as far as I could see. From the outside at least. Anything's okay, even a feeling you got or something. Your ear looks normal to me. My cousin looked disappointed. Maybe I had said the wrong thing. Did the treatment hurt? I asked. No, it didn't. Same as always. They just rummaged around in the same old spot. Feels like they're going to wear it out. Sometimes it doesn't feel like my own ear anymore. There's the number 28, my cousin said after a while, turning to me. That's our bus, right? I'd been lost in thought. I looked up when he said this and saw the bus slowing down as it went round the curve coming up the slope. This wasn't the kind of brand new bus we'd ridden over on, but one of the older buses I remembered. A sign with the number 28 was hanging on the front. I tried to stand up from the bench, but I couldn't. Like I was caught up in the middle of a powerful current, my limbs wouldn't respond. I'd been thinking of the box of chocolates we'd taken when we went to that hospital on that long-ago summer afternoon. The girl had happily opened the lid to the box only to discover that the dozen little chocolates had completely melted, sticking to the paper between each piece and to the lid itself. On the way to the hospital my friend and I had parked the motorcycle by the seaside, and lay around on the beach just talking and hanging out. The whole while we'd let that box of chocolates lie out in the hot August sun. Our carelessness, our self-centeredness, had wrecked those chocolates, made one fine mess of them all. We should have sensed what was happening. One of us, it didn't matter who, should have said something. But on that afternoon, we didn't sense anything, just exchanged a couple of dumb jokes and said goodbye. And left that hill still overgrown with blind willows. My cousin grabbed my right arm in a tight grip. "Are you all right?" he asked me. His words brought me back to reality, and I stood up from the bench. This time I had no trouble standing. Once more I could feel on my skin the sweet May breeze. For a few seconds I stood there in a strange, dim place. Where the things I could see didn't exist. Where the invisible did. Finally, though, the real number 28 bus stopped in front of me, its entirely real door opening. I clambered aboard, heading off to some other place. I rested my hand on my cousin's shoulder. "I'm all right," I told him. Translated by Philip Gabriel. Birthday girl. She waited on tables, as usual, that day, her 20th birthday. She always worked on Fridays, but if things had gone according to plan that particular Friday, she would have had the night off. The other part-time girl had agreed to switch shifts with her as a matter of course. Being screamed at by an angry chef while lugging pumpkin gnocchi and seafood fritto misto to customers' tables was no way to spend one's 20th birthday. But the other girl had aggravated a cold and gone to bed with unstoppable diarrhea and a fever of 104, so she ended up working after all on short notice. She found herself trying to comfort the sick girl, who had called to apologize. "Don't worry about it," she said. "I wasn't going to do anything special anyway, even if it is my 20th birthday." And in fact she was not all that disappointed. One reason was the terrible argument she had had a few days earlier with the boyfriend who was supposed to be with her that night. They had been going together since high school. The argument had started from nothing much, but it had taken an unexpected turn for the worse until it became a long and bitter shouting match, one bad enough, she was pretty sure, to have snapped their long-standing ties once and for all. Something inside her had turned rock hard and died. He had not called her since the blow-up, and she was not about to call him. Her workplace was one of the better-known Italian restaurants in the Toni Roppongi district of Tokyo. It had been in business since the late 60s, and while its cuisine was hardly cutting-edge, its high reputation was fully justified. It had many repeat customers and they were never disappointed. The dining room had a calm, relaxed atmosphere without a hint of pushiness. Rather than a young crowd, the restaurant drew an older clientele that included some famous stage people and writers. The two full-time waiters worked 6 days a week. She and the other part-time waitress were students who took turns working 3 days each. In addition there was one floor manager and, at the register, a skinny middle-aged woman who supposedly had been there since the restaurant opened, literally sitting in the one place, it seemed, like some gloomy old character. From Little Dorrit. She had exactly 2 functions, to accept payment from the customers and to answer the phone. She spoke only when necessary and always wore the same black dress. There was something cold and hard about her. If you set her afloat on the nighttime sea, she would probably sink any boat that happened to ram her. The floor manager was perhaps in his late 40s. Tall and broad-shouldered, his build suggested that he had been a sportsman in his youth, but excess flesh was now beginning to accumulate on his belly and chin. His short, stiff hair was thinning at the crown, and a special aging bachelor smell clung to him, like newsprint that had been stored in a drawer with cough drops. She had a bachelor uncle who smelled like that. The manager always wore a black suit, white shirt, and bow tie, not a clip-on bow tie, but the real thing, tied by hand. It was a point of pride for him that he could tie it perfectly without looking in the mirror. He performed his duties adroitly day after day. They consisted of checking the arrival and departure of guests, keeping abreast of the reservation schedule, knowing the names of regular customers, greeting them with a smile, lending a respectful ear to any complaints that might arise, giving expert advice on wines, and overseeing the work of the waiters and waitresses. It was also his special task to deliver dinner to the room of the restaurant's owner. The owner had his own room on the 6th floor of the same building where the restaurant was, she said. An apartment, or office, or something. Somehow she and I had gotten on to the subject of our 20th birthdays, what sort of day it had been for each of us. Most people remember the day they turned 20. Hers had happened more than 10 years earlier. He never, ever showed his face in the restaurant, though. The only one who saw him was the manager. It was strictly his job to deliver the owner's dinner to him. None of the other employees knew what he looked like. So basically, the owner was getting home delivery from his own restaurant. Right, she said. Every night at 8, the manager had to bring dinner to the owner's room. It was the restaurant's busiest time, so having the manager disappear just then was always a problem for us, but there was no way around it because that was the way it had always been done. They'd load the dinner onto one of those carts that hotels use for room service, the manager would push it into the elevator wearing a respectful look on his face, and 15 minutes later he'd come back empty-handed. Then, an hour later, he'd go up again and bring down the cart with empty plates and glasses. Every day, like clockwork. I thought it was really weird the first time I saw it happen. It was like some kind of religious ritual, you know. But after a while I got used to it, and never gave it a second thought. The owner always had chicken. The recipe and the vegetable sides are a little different every day, but the main dish was always chicken. A young chef once told her that he had tried sending up the same exact roast chicken every day for a week just to see what would happen, but there was never any complaint. A chef wants to try different ways of preparing things, of course, and each new chef would challenge himself with every technique for chicken that he could think of. They'd make elegant sauces, they'd try chickens from different suppliers, but none of their efforts had any effect. They might just as well have been throwing pebbles into an empty cave. In the end, every one of them gave up and sent the owner some run-of-the-mill chicken dish every day. That's all that was ever asked of them. Work started as usual on her 20th birthday, November 17th. It had been raining on and off since the afternoon, and pouring since early evening. At 5 o'clock the manager gathered the employees together to explain the day's specials. Servers were required to memorize them word for word and not use crib sheets: veal Milanese, pasta topped with sardines and cabbage, chestnut mousse. Sometimes the manager would play the role of a customer and test them with questions. Then came the employees' meal. Waiters in this restaurant were not going to have growling stomachs as they took their customers' orders. The restaurant opened its doors at 6 o'clock, but guests were slow to arrive because of the downpour, and several reservations were simply cancelled. Women didn't want their dresses ruined by the rain. The manager walked around tight-lipped, and the waiters killed time polishing the salt and pepper shakers or chatting with the chef about cooking. She surveyed the dining room with its single couple at table and listened to the harpsichord music flowing discreetly from ceiling speakers. A deep smell of late autumn rain worked its way into the restaurant. It was after 7:30 when the manager started feeling sick. He stumbled over to a chair and sat there for a while pressing his stomach, as if he had just been shot. A greasy sweat clung to his forehead. "I think I'd better go to the hospital," he muttered. For him to be taken ill was a most unusual occurrence. He had never missed a day since he started working in the restaurant over 10 years earlier. It was another point of pride for him that he had never been out with illness or injury, but his painful grimace made it clear that he was in very bad shape. She stepped outside with an umbrella and hailed a cab. One of the waiters held the manager steady and climbed into the car with him to take him to a nearby hospital. Before ducking into the cab, the manager said to her hoarsely, "I want you to take a dinner up to room 604 at 8 o'clock. All you have to do is ring the bell, say, 'Your dinner is here,' and leave it." "That's room 604, right?" she said. "At 8 o'clock, he repeated. "On the dot." He grimaced again. Climbed in, and the taxi took him away. The rain showed no signs of letting up after the manager had left, and customers arrived at long intervals. No more than 1 or 2 tables were occupied at a time, so if the manager and one waiter had to be absent, this was a good time for it to happen. Things could get so busy that it was not unusual even for the full staff to have trouble coping. When the owner's meal was ready at 8 o'clock, she pushed the room service cart into the elevator and rode up to the 6th floor. It was the standard meal for him: a half bottle of red wine with the cork loosened, a thermal pot of coffee, a chicken entree with steamed vegetables, rolls and butter. The heavy aroma of cooked chicken quickly filled the little elevator. It mingled with the smell of the rain. Water droplets dotted the elevator floor, suggesting that someone with a wet umbrella had recently been aboard. She pushed the cart down the corridor, bringing it to a stop in front of the door marked 604. She double-checked her memory, 604. That was it. She cleared her throat and pressed the doorbell. There was no answer. She stood there for a good 20 seconds. Just as she was thinking of pressing the bell again, the door opened inward and a skinny old man appeared. He was shorter than she was, by some 4 or 5 inches. He had on a dark suit and a necktie. Against his white shirt, the tie stood out distinctly, its brownish-yellow coloring like withered leaves. He made a very clean impression, his clothes perfectly pressed, his white hair smoothed down. He looked as though he were about to go out for the night to some sort of gathering. The deep wrinkles that creased his brow made her think of ravines in an aerial photograph. "Your dinner, sir," she said in a husky voice, then quietly cleared her throat again. Her voice grew husky whenever she was tense. "Dinner?" "Yes, sir." The manager suddenly took sick. I had to take his place today. "Your meal, sir." "Oh, I see," the old man said, almost as if talking to himself, his hand still perched on the doorknob. "Took sick, eh? You don't say." His stomach started to hurt him all of a sudden. He went to the hospital. He thinks he might have appendicitis. "Oh, that's not good," the old man said, running his fingers along the wrinkles of his forehead. "Not good at all." She cleared her throat again. "Shall I bring your meal in, sir?" she asked. "Ah yes, of course," the old man said. "Yes, of course, if you wish." "That's fine with me." "If I wish?" She thought. What a strange way to put it. What am I supposed to wish? The old man opened the door the rest of the way, and she wheeled the cart inside. The floor had short gray carpeting with no area for removing shoes. The first room was a large study, as though the apartment was more a workplace than a residence. The window looked out on the nearby Tokyo Tower, its steel skeleton outlined in lights. A large desk stood by the window, and beside the desk was a compact sofa and love seat. The old man pointed to the plastic laminate coffee table in front of the sofa. She arranged his meal on the table, white napkin and silverware, coffee pot and cup, wine and wineglass, bread and butter, and the plate of chicken and vegetables. "If you would be kind enough to set the dishes in the hall as usual, sir, I'll come to get them in an hour." Her words seemed to snap him out of an appreciative contemplation of his dinner. "Oh yes, of course. I'll put them in the hall. On the cart. In an hour. If you wish." "Yes," she replied inwardly, "for the moment that is exactly what I wish." "Is there anything else I can do for you, sir?" "No, I don't think so," he said after a moment's consideration. He was wearing black shoes polished to a high sheen. They were small and chic. He's a stylish dresser, she thought. And he stands very straight for his age. "Well, then, sir, I'll be getting back to work." "Of course not," I said. She was not the sort of person to invent some goofy story out of thin air. "So, did you make a wish?" She went on looking at me for a while, then released a tiny sigh. "Don't get me wrong," she said. "I wasn't taking him 100% seriously myself. I mean, at 20 you're not exactly living in a fairy tale world anymore." If this was his idea of a joke, though, I had to hand it to him for coming up with it on the spot. He was a dapper old fellow with a twinkle in his eye, so I decided to play along with him. It was my 20th birthday, after all. I figured I ought to have something not so ordinary happen to me that day. It wasn't a question of believing or not believing. I nodded without saying anything. You can understand how I felt, I'm sure. My 20th birthday was coming to an end without anything special happening, nobody wishing me a happy birthday, and all I'm doing is carrying tortellini with anchovy sauce to people's tables. I nodded again. Don't worry, I said. I understand. So I made a wish. The old man kept his gaze fixed on her, saying nothing, hands still on the desk. Also on the desk were several thick folders that might have been account books, plus writing implements, a calendar, and a lamp with a green shade. Lying among them, his small hands looked like another set of desktop furnishings. The rain continued to beat against the window, the lights of Tokyo Tower filtering through the shattered drops. The wrinkles on the old man's forehead deepened slightly. That is your wish? Yes, she said. That is my wish. A bit unusual for a girl your age, he said. I was expecting something different. If it's no good, I'll wish for something else, she said, clearing her throat. I don't mind. I'll think of something else. No, no, the old man said, raising his hands and waving them like flags. There's nothing wrong with it, not at all. It's just a little surprising, miss. Don't you have something else? Like, say, you want to be prettier, or smarter, or rich, you're okay with not wishing for something like that. Something an ordinary girl would ask for. She took some moments to search for the right words. The old man just waited, saying nothing, his hands at rest together on the desk again. Of course I'd like to be prettier or smarter or rich. But I really can't imagine what would happen to me if any of those things came true. They might be more than I could handle. I still don't really know what life is all about. I don't know how it works. I see, the old man said, intertwining his fingers and separating them. Again. I see. So, is my wish okay? Of course, he said. Of course. It's no trouble at all for me. The old man suddenly fixed his eyes on a spot in the air. The wrinkles of his forehead deepened, they might have been the wrinkles of his brain itself as it concentrated on his thoughts. He seemed to be staring at something, perhaps all but invisible bits of down, floating in the air. He opened his arms wide, lifted himself slightly from his chair, and whipped his palms together with a dry smack. Settling in the chair again, he slowly ran his fingertips along the wrinkles of his brow as if to soften them, and then turned to her with a gentle smile. That did it, he said. Your wish has been granted. Already? Yes, it was no trouble at all. Your wish has been granted, lovely miss. Happy birthday. You may go back to work now. Don't worry, I'll put the cart in the hall. She took the elevator down to the restaurant. Empty-handed now, she felt almost disturbingly light, as though she were walking on some kind of mysterious fluff. Are you okay? You look spaced out, the younger waiter said to her. She gave him an ambiguous smile and shook her head. Oh, really? No, I'm fine. Tell me about the owner. What's he like? I dunno, I didn't get a very good look at him, she said, cutting the conversation short. An hour later she went to bring the cart down. It was out in the hall. Utensils in place. She lifted the lid to find the chicken and vegetables gone. The wine bottle and coffee pot were empty. The door to room 604 stood there, closed and expressionless. She stared at it for a time, feeling it might open at any moment, but it did not open. She brought the cart down in the elevator and wheeled it into the dishwasher. The chef looked blankly at the plate, empty as always. I never saw the owner again, she said. Not once. The manager turned out to have just an ordinary stomachache and went back to delivering the owner's meal again himself the next day. I quit the job after New Year's, and I've never been back to the place. I don't know, I just felt it was better not to go near there, kind of like a premonition. She toyed with a paper coaster, thinking her own thoughts. Sometimes I get the feeling that everything that happened to me on my 20th birthday was some kind of illusion. It's as though something happened to make me think that things happened that never really happened at all. But I know for sure that they did happen. I can still bring back vivid images of every piece of furniture and every knick-knack in room 604. What happened to me in there really happened, and it had an important meaning for me, too. The two of us kept silent, drinking our drinks and thinking our separate thoughts. "Do you mind if I ask you one thing?" I asked. "Or, more precisely, two things." "Go right ahead," she said. "I imagine you're going to ask me what I wished for that time. That's the first thing you want to know. But it looks as though you don't want to talk about that. Does it?" I nodded. She put the coaster down and narrowed her eyes as if staring at something in the distance. "You're not supposed to tell anybody what you wished for, you know." "I won't try to drag it out of you," I said. "I would like to know whether or not it came true, though. And also, whatever the wish itself might have been, whether or not you later came to regret what it was you chose to wish for. Were you ever sorry you didn't wish for something else?" The answer to the first question is yes and also no. I still have a lot of living left to do, probably. I haven't seen how things are going to work out to the end. So it was a wish that takes time to come true. You could say that. Time is going to play an important role. Like in cooking certain dishes. She nodded. I thought about that for a moment, but the only thing that came to mind was the image of a gigantic pie cooking slowly in an oven at low heat. And the answer to my second question? What was that again? Whether you ever regretted your choice of what to wish for. A moment of silence followed. The eyes she turned on me seemed to lack any depth. The desiccated shadow of a smile flickered at the corners of her mouth, suggesting a kind of hushed sense of resignation. "I'm married now," she said. "To a CPA 3 years older than me. And I have 2 children, a boy and a girl. We have an Irish setter. I drive an Audi, and I play tennis with my girlfriends twice a week. That's the life I'm living now." "Sounds pretty good to me," I said. "Even if the Audi's bumper has 2 dents." "Hey, bumpers are made for denting." "That would make a great bumper sticker," she said. "Bumpers are for denting." I looked at her mouth when she said that. "What I'm trying to tell you is this," she said more softly, scratching an earlobe. It was a beautifully shaped earlobe. "No matter what they wish for, no matter how far they go, people can never be anything but themselves. That's all." "There's another good bumper sticker," I said. "No matter how far they go, people can never be anything but themselves." She laughed aloud, with a real show of pleasure, and the shadow was gone. She rested her elbow on the bar and looked at me. "Tell me," she said. "What would you have wished for if you had been in my position?" "On the night of my 20th birthday, you mean?" "Uh-huh." I took some time to think about that, but I couldn't come up with a single wish. "I can't think of anything," I confessed. "I'm too far away now from my 20th birthday." "You really can't think of anything?" I nodded. "Not one thing?" "Not one thing." She looked into my eyes again, straight in, and said, "That's because you've already made your wish. But you had better think about it very carefully, my lovely young fairy, because I can grant you only one." In the darkness somewhere, an old man wearing a withered leaf-colored tie raises a finger. "Just one. You can't change your mind afterward and take it back." Translated by J. Rubin. New York mining disaster. A friend of mine has a habit of going to the zoo whenever there's a typhoon. He's been doing this for 10 years. At a time when most people are closing their shutters, running out to stock up on mineral water, or checking to see if their radios and flashlights are working, my friend wraps himself in a Vietnam-era army surplus poncho, stuffs a couple of cans of beer into his pockets, and sets off. He lives about a 15-minute walk away. If he's unlucky, the zoo is closed, owing to inclement weather, and its gates are locked. When this happens, my friend sits down on the stone statue of a squirrel next to the entrance, drinks his lukewarm beer, and then heads back home. But when he makes it there in time, he pays the entrance fee, lights a soggy cigarette, and surveys the animals, one by one. Most of them have retreated to their shelters. Some stare blankly at the rain. Others are more animated, jumping around in the gale-force winds. Some are frightened by the sudden drop in barometric pressure, others turn vicious. My friend makes a point of drinking his first beer in front of the Bengal tiger cage. Bengal tigers always react the most violently to storms. He drinks his second one outside the gorilla cage. Most of the time the gorillas aren't the least bit disturbed by the typhoon. They stare at him calmly as he sits like a mermaid on the concrete floor sipping his beer, and you'd swear they actually feel sorry for him. It's like being in an elevator when it breaks down and you're trapped inside with strangers, my friend tells me. Typhoons aside, my friend's no different from anyone else. He works for an export company, managing foreign investments. It's not one of your better firms, but it does well enough. He lives alone in a neat little apartment and gets a new girlfriend every 6 months. Why he insists on having a new one every 6 months, and it's always exactly 6 months, I'll never understand. The girls all look the same, like perfect clones of one another. I can't tell them apart. My friend owns a nice used car, the collected works of Balzac, and a black suit, black tie, and black shoes that are perfect for attending funerals. Every time someone dies, I call him and ask if I can borrow them, even though the shoes are one size too big for me. Sorry to bother you again, I said the last time I called. Another funerals come up. Help yourself. You must be in a hurry, he answered. Why don't you come over right away? When I arrived, the suit and tie were laid out on the table, neatly pressed, the shoes were polished, and the fridge was full of imported beer. That's the kind of guy he is. The other day I saw a cat at the zoo, he said, popping open a beer. A cat? Yeah, 2 weeks ago. I was in Hokkaido on business and dropped by a zoo near my hotel. There was a cat asleep in a cage with a sign that said, cat. What kind of cat? Just an ordinary one. Brown stripes, short tail. And unbelievably fat. It just plopped down on its side and lay there. Maybe cats aren't so common in Hokkaido. You're kidding me, right? He asked, astonished. There must be cats in Hokkaido. They can't be that unusual. Well, look at it another way, why shouldn't there be cats in a zoo? I said. They're animals, too, right? Cats and dogs are your run-of-the-mill type animals. Nobody's going to pay money to see them, he said. Just look around you, they're everywhere. Same thing with people. When we'd finished off the six-pack, I put the suit and tie and shoe box into a large paper bag. Sorry to keep doing this to you, I said. I know I should buy my own suit, but somehow I never get around to it. I feel like if I buy funeral clothes I'm saying that it's okay if somebody dies. No problem, he said. I'm not using them anyway. Better to have someone use them than to have them hanging in the closet, right? It was true that in the 3 years since he'd had the suit he'd hardly worn it. It's weird, but since I bought the suit not a single person I know has died, he explained. That's the way it goes. Yeah, that's the way it goes, he said. For me, on the other hand, it was the year of funerals. Friends and former friends died one after another, like ears of corn withering in a drought. I was 28. My friends were all about the same age, 27, 28, 29. Not exactly the right age to die. A poet might die at 21, a revolutionary, or a rock star at 24. But after that you assume everything's going to be all right. You've made it past Dead Man's Curve and you're out of the tunnel, cruising straight for your destination down a 6-lane highway, whether you want to be or not. You get your hair cut, every morning you shave. You aren't a poet anymore, or a revolutionary or a rock star. You don't pass out drunk in phone booths or blast out the doors at 4 in the morning. Instead, you buy life insurance from your friend's company, drink in hotel bars, and hold on to your dental bills for tax deductions. At 28, that's normal. But that's exactly when the unexpected massacre began. It was like a surprise attack on a lazy spring day, as if someone, on top of a metaphysical hill, holding a metaphysical machine gun, had sprayed us with bullets. 1 minute we were changing our clothes, and the next minute they didn't fit anymore, the sleeves were inside out, and we had one leg in one pair of pants, the other in a different pair. A complete mess. But that's what death is. A rabbit is a rabbit whether it springs out of a hat or a wheat field. A hot oven is a hot oven, and the black smoke rising from a chimney is what it is, black smoke rising from a chimney. The first person to straddle the divide between reality and unreality, or unreality and reality, was a friend from college who taught English at a junior high school. He'd been married for 3 years, and his wife had gone back to her parents' house in Shikoku to have their baby. One unusually warm Sunday afternoon in January, he went to a department store and bought 2 cans of shaving cream and a German-made knife big enough to lop off an elephant's ear. He went home and ran a bath. He got some ice from the fridge, downed a bottle of scotch, climbed into the tub, and slit his wrists. His mother found the body 2 days later. The police came and took a lot of photographs. Blood had dyed the bath the color of tomato juice. The police ruled it a suicide. After all, the doors had been locked and, of course, the deceased had bought the knife himself. But why did he buy 2 cans of shaving cream that he didn't plan to use? No one knew. Maybe it hadn't hit him when he was at the department store that in a couple of hours he'd be dead. Or maybe he was afraid that the cashier would guess that he was going to kill himself. He didn't leave a will or a farewell note. On the kitchen table there was only a glass, the empty whiskey bottle and ice bowl, and the 2 cans of shaving cream. While he was waiting for the bath to fill, knocking back glass after glass of Hague on the rocks, he must have stared at those cans and thought something along the lines of "I'll never have to shave again." A man's death at 28 is as sad as the winter rain. One died in March in an incident at an oil field in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, and 2 died in June, a heart attack and a traffic accident. From July to November peace reigned, but then in December another friend died, also in a car crash. Unlike my first friend, who'd killed himself, these friends never had the time to realize that they were dying. For them it was like climbing up a staircase they'd climbed 1,000,000 times before and suddenly finding a step missing. "Would you make up the bed for me?" the friend who died of a heart attack had asked his wife. He was a furniture designer. It was 11 o'clock in the morning. He'd woken up at 9, worked for a while in his room, and then said he felt sleepy. He went to the kitchen, made some coffee, and drank it. But the coffee didn't help. "I think I'll take a nap," he said. "I hear a buzzing sound in the back of my head." Those were his last words. He curled up in bed, went to sleep, and never woke up again. The friend who died in December was the youngest, and the only woman. She was 24, like a revolutionary or a rock star. One cold rainy night just before Christmas, she was flattened in a tragic yet quite ordinary space between a beer delivery truck and a concrete telephone pole. A few days after the last funeral, I went to my friend's apartment to return the suit, which I'd picked up from the dry cleaners, and to give him a bottle of whiskey to thank him. "Much obliged." "I really appreciate it," I said. As usual, his fridge was full of cold beer, and his comfortable sofa reflected a faint ray of sunlight. On the coffee table there was a clean ashtray and a pot of Christmas poinsettias. He took the suit, in its plastic covering, from me, his movements. Leisurely, like those of a bear just coming out of hibernation, and quietly put it away. I hope the suit doesn't smell like a funeral, I said. Clothes aren't important. The real problem is what's inside them. I murmured. One funeral after another for you this year, he said, stretching out on the sofa and pouring beer into a glass. How many altogether? 5, I said, spreading out the fingers of my left hand. But I think that's got to be it. Are you sure? Enough people have died. It's like the curse of the pyramids or something, he said. I remember reading that somewhere. The curse continues until enough people have died. Or else a red star appears in the sky and the moon's shadow covers the sun. After we finished a 6-pack, we started on the whiskey. The winter sunlight sloped gently into the room. You look a little glum these days, he said. You think so? I said. You must be thinking about things too much in the middle of the night. He said. I've stopped thinking about things at night. How'd you manage that? When I get depressed, I start to clean. Even if it's 2 or 3 in the morning. I wash the dishes, wipe off the stove, mop the floor, bleach the dish towels, organize my desk drawers, iron every shirt in sight, he said, stirring his drink with his finger. I do that till I'm exhausted, then I have a drink and go to sleep. In the morning I get up and by the time I'm putting on my socks I can't even remember what it was I was thinking about. I looked around again. As always, the room was clean and orderly. People think of all kinds of things at 3 in the morning. We all do. That's why we each have to figure out our own way of fighting it off. You're probably right, I said. Even animals think things over at 3 a.m., he said, as if remembering something. Have you ever gone to the zoo at 3 a.m.? No, I answered vaguely. No, of course not. I've only done it once. A friend of mine works at a zoo, and I asked him to let me in when he had the night shift. You're not supposed to, really. He shook his glass. It was a strange experience. I can't explain it, but I felt as if the ground had silently split open and something was crawling up out of it. And then there was this invisible thing on a rampage in the dark. It was like the cold night had coagulated. I couldn't see it, but I felt it, and the animals felt it, too. It made me think about the fact that the ground we walk on goes all the way to the Earth's core, and I suddenly realized that the core has sucked up an incredible amount of time. I didn't say anything. Anyway, I never want to go again, to the zoo in the middle of the night, I mean. You prefer a typhoon? Yeah, he said. Gimme a typhoon any day. The phone rang and he went to his bedroom to take the call. It was his girlfriend Clone, with another endless clone phone call. I wanted to tell him I was going to call it a day, but he was on the phone forever. I gave up waiting and switched on the TV. It was a 27-inch color set with the kind of remote control you barely have to touch to change the channel. The TV had 6 speakers and great sound. I'd never seen such a wonderful TV. I made 2 complete rounds of the channels before settling on a news program. A border clash, a fire, exchange rates going up and down, a new limit on car imports, an outdoor winter swim meet, a family suicide. All these bits of news seemed somehow connected, like people in a high school graduation photo. Any interesting news? My friend asked as he came back into the room. Not really, I said. Do you watch a lot of TV? I shook my head. I don't have a TV. There's at least one good thing about TV, he said after a while. You can shut it off whenever you like. And nobody complains. He pushed the off button on the remote. Immediately, the screen went blank. The room was still. Outside the window, lights in other buildings were starting to come on. We sat there for 5 minutes, drinking whiskey, with nothing to talk about. The telephone rang again, but he pretended not to hear it. Just as the phone stopped ringing, he hit the on button. The picture returned instantly, and a commentator standing in front of a graph gestured with a pointer as he explained changes in the price of oil. See? He didn't even notice that we'd switched him off for 5 minutes. True enough, I said. Why is that? It was too much trouble to think it through, so I shook my head. When you switch it off, one side ceases to exist. It's him or us. You just hit the switch and there's a communications blackout. It's easy. That's one way of thinking of it, I said. There are millions of ways of thinking. In India they grow coconut trees. In Argentina it rains political prisoners from helicopters. He switched the TV off again. I don't want to say anything about other people, he said, but consider the fact that there are ways of dying that don't end in funerals. Types of death you can't smell. I nodded silently. I felt that I knew what he was getting at. At the same time, I felt that I had no idea what he meant. I was tired and a bit confused. I sat there, fingering one of the poinsettia's green leaves. I've got some champagne, he said earnestly. I brought it back from a business trip to France a while ago. I don't know much about champagne, but this is supposed to be great. Would you like some? Champagne might be just the thing after a string of funerals. He brought out the chilled champagne bottle and 2 clean glasses and set them quietly on the table, then smiled slyly. Champagne's completely useless, you know, he said. The only good part is the moment you pop the cork. I can't argue with you there, I said. We popped the cork, and talked for a while about the zoo in Paris and the animals that live there. The champagne was excellent. There was a party at the end of the year, an annual New Year's Eve party at a bar in Roppongi that had been rented for the occasion. A piano trio played, and there was a lot of good food and drink. When I ran across someone I knew, I'd chat for a while. My job required that I put in an appearance every year. Parties aren't my thing, but this one was easy to take. I had nothing else to do on New Year's Eve and could just stand by myself in a corner, relax, have a drink, and enjoy the music. No obnoxious people, no need to be introduced to strangers and listen to them rant for half an hour about how a vegetarian diet cures cancer. But that evening someone introduced me to a woman. After the usual small talk, I tried to retreat to my corner again. But the woman followed me back to my seat, whiskey glass in hand. I asked to be introduced to you, she said amiably. She wasn't the type to turn heads, though she was certainly attractive. She was wearing an expensive green silk dress. I guessed that she was about 32. She could easily have made herself look younger, but she didn't seem to think it was worth the trouble. 3 rings graced her fingers, and a faint smile played on her lips. You look exactly like someone I know, she said. Your facial features. Your back, the way you talk, your overall mood, it's an amazing likeness. I've been watching you ever since you came in. If he's that much like me, I'd like to meet the guy, I said. I had no idea what else to say. You would? I'd like to see what it feels like to meet someone who's exactly like me. Her smile deepened for an instant, then softened. But that's impossible, she said. He died 5 years ago. When he was about the same age you are now. Is that right? I said. I killed him. The trio was just finishing its second set, and there was a smattering of half-hearted applause. Do you like music? She asked me. I do if it's nice music in a nice world, I said. In a nice world there is no nice music, she said, as if revealing some deep secret. In a nice world the air doesn't vibrate. I see, I said, not knowing how to respond. Have you seen the movie where Warren Beatty plays the piano in a nightclub? No, I haven't. Elizabeth Taylor is one of the customers at the club, and she's really poor and miserable. So Warren Beatty asks Elizabeth Taylor if she has any requests. And does she? I forget. It's a really old movie. Her ring sparkled as she drank her whiskey. I hate requests. They make me feel unhappy. It's like when I take a book out of the library. As soon as I start to read it, all I can think about is when I'll finish it. She put a cigarette between her lips. I struck a match and lit it for her. Let's see, she said. We were talking about the person who looked like you. How did you kill him? I threw him into a beehive. You're kidding, right? Yes, she said. Instead of sighing, I took a sip of whiskey. The ice had melted and it barely tasted like whiskey anymore. Of course, legally I'm not a murderer, she said. Or morally, either. Neither legally nor morally a murderer. I didn't want to, but I reviewed the points she'd made. But you did kill someone. Right. She nodded happily. Someone who looked just like you. Across the room a man let out a loud laugh. And the people around him laughed, too. Glasses clinked. It sounded very far away but extremely clear. I don't know why, but my heart was pounding, as if it were expanding or moving up and down. I felt as if I were walking on ground that was floating on water. It took less than 5 seconds, she said. To kill him. We were silent for a while. She was taking her time, savoring the silence. Do you ever think about freedom? She asked. Sometimes, I said. Why do you ask? Can you draw a daisy? I think so. Is this a personality test? Almost. She laughed. Well, did I pass? Yes, she answered. You'll be fine. Nothing to worry about. Intuition tells me you'll live a good long life. Thank you, I said. The band began playing Auld Lang Syne. 11:55, she said, glancing at the gold watch on her pendant. I really like Auld Lang Syne. How about you? I prefer Home on the Range. All those deer and antelope. She smiled. You must like animals. I do, I said. And I thought of my friend who likes zoos, and of his funeral suit. I enjoyed talking to you. Goodbye. Goodbye, I said. They blew out their lamps to save on air, and darkness surrounded them. No one spoke. All they could hear in the dark was the sound of water dripping from the ceiling every 5 seconds. Okay, everybody, try not to breathe so much. We don't have much air left, an old miner said. He held his voice to a whisper, but even so the wooden beams on the ceiling of the tunnel creaked faintly. In the dark, the miners huddled together, straining to hear one sound. The sound of pickaxes. The sound of life. They waited for hours. Reality began to melt away in the darkness. Everything began to feel as if it were happening a long time ago, in a world far away. Or was it happening in the future, in a different far-off world? Outside, people were digging a hole, trying to reach them. It was like a scene from a movie. Translated by Philip Gabriel. Airplane, or How He Talked to Himself as if Reciting Poetry. That afternoon she asked him, Is that an old habit, the way you talk to yourself? She raised her eyes from the table and put the question to him as if the thought had just struck her, but it had obviously not just struck her. She must have been thinking about it for a while. Her voice had that hard but slightly husky edge it always took on at times like this. She had held the words back and rolled them around on her tongue again and again before she let them out of her mouth. The two were sitting opposite each other at the kitchen table. Aside from the occasional commuter train running on a nearby track, the neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet at times. Tracks without trains passing over them have a mysterious silence all their own. The vinyl tile of the kitchen floor gave his bare feet a pleasant chill. He had pulled his socks off and stuffed them into his pants pocket. The weather was a bit too warm for an April afternoon. She had rolled up the sleeves of her pale checked shirt as far as the elbows, and her slim white fingers toyed with the handle of her coffee spoon. He stared at the moving fingertips, and the workings of his mind went strangely flat. She seemed to have lifted the edge of the world, and now she was loosening its threads little by little, perfunctorily, apathetically, as if she had to do it no matter how long it might take. He watched and said nothing. He said nothing because he did not know what to say. The few sips of coffee left in his cup were cold now, and muddy looking. He had just turned 20, and she was 7 years older, married, and the mother of one. For him she might as well have been the far side of the moon. Her husband worked for a travel agency that specialized in trips abroad. And so he was away from home nearly half of every month, in places like London or Rome or Singapore. He obviously liked opera. Thick 3- and 4-record albums lined the shelves, arranged by composer, Verdi, Puccini, Donizetti, Richard Strauss. The long rows seemed less like a record collection than a symbol of a worldview, calm, immovable. He looked at the husband's records whenever he was at a loss for words or for something to do. He would let his eyes wander over the album spines, from right to left, from left to right, and read the titles aloud in his mind: La Bohème, Tosca, Turandot, Norma, Fidelio. He had never once listened to music like that. Far from knowing whether he liked it or not, he had never had the chance to hear it. Not one person among his family, friends, or acquaintances was an opera fan. He knew that a music called opera existed, and that certain people liked to listen to it, but the husband's records were his first actual glimpse of such a world. She herself was not particularly fond of opera. "I don't hate it," she said. "It's just too long." Next to the record shelves stood a very impressive stereo set. Its big, foreign-made tube amp hunched down heavily, waiting for orders like a well-trained crustacean. There was no way to prevent it from standing out among the room's other, more modest furnishings. It had a truly exceptional presence. One's eyes could not help fixing on it. But he had never once heard it producing sound. She had no idea where to find the power switch, and he never thought to touch the thing. "There's nothing wrong at home," she told him, any number of times. "My husband is good to me, I love my daughter, I think I'm happy." She sounded calm, even serene, as she said this, without a hint that she was making excuses for her life. She spoke of her marriage with complete objectivity, as though discussing traffic regulations or the international date line. "I think I'm happy, there's nothing wrong. So why the hell is she sleeping with me?" He wondered. He gave it lots of thought but couldn't come up with an answer. What did it even mean for there to be something wrong with a marriage? He sometimes thought of asking her directly, but he didn't know how to start. How should he say it? "If you're so happy, why the hell are you sleeping with me?" Should he just come out with it like that? He was sure it would make her cry, though. She cried enough as it was. She would cry for a long, long time, making tiny sounds. He almost never knew why she was crying. But once she started, she wouldn't stop. Try and comfort her as he might, she would not stop crying until a certain amount of time had gone by. In fact, he didn't have to do anything at all. Once a certain amount of time had gone by, her crying would come to an end. Why were people so different from one another? He wondered. He had been with any number of women, all of whom would cry, or get angry, each in her own special way. They had points of similarity, but those were far outnumbered by the differences. It seemed to have nothing to do with age. This was his first experience with an older woman, but the difference in age didn't bother him as much as he had expected it to. Far more meaningful than age differences, he felt, were the different tendencies that each individual possessed. He couldn't help thinking that this was an important key for unlocking the riddle of life. After she finished crying, usually, the two of them would make love. Only after crying would she be the one to initiate it. Otherwise, he had to be the one. Sometimes she would refuse him. Without a word, she would shake her head. Then her eyes would look like white moons floating at the edge of a dawn sky, flat, suggestive moons that shimmered at the single cry of a bird at dawn. Whenever he saw her eyes looking like that, he knew there was nothing more he could say to her. Rejected, he felt neither anger nor displeasure. That's how it goes, he thought, nothing more. Sometimes it even made him feel relieved deep inside. They would sit at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, chatting quietly. They spoke in fragments most of the time. Neither was a great talker, and they had little in common to talk about. He could never remember what it was that they had been saying, just that it had been in little pieces. And all the while, one commuter train after another would go past the window. Their lovemaking was always something hushed and tranquil. It had nothing that could properly be called the joys of the flesh. Of course it would be false to say that they knew nothing of the pleasure that obtains when a man and a woman join their bodies. But mixed with this were far too many other thoughts and elements and styles. It was different from any sex he had experienced before. It made him think of a small room, a nice, neat room that was a comfortable place to be. It had strings of many colors hanging from the ceiling, strings of different shapes and lengths, and each string, in its own way, sent a thrill of enticement through him. He wanted to pull one, and the strings wanted to be pulled by him. But he didn't know which one to pull. He felt that he might pull a string and have a magnificent spectacle open up before his eyes, but that, just as easily, everything could be ruined in an instant. And so he hesitated, and while he lingered in confusion another day would end. The strangeness of this situation was almost too much for him. He believed that he had lived his life with his own sense of values. But when he was in this room, hearing the trains go by and holding the silent older woman in his arms, he couldn't help but feel that he was wandering through chaos. Again and again he would ask himself, am I in love with her? But he could never reach an answer with complete conviction. All he could understand were the colored strings hanging from the little room's ceiling. They were right there. When this strange lovemaking ended, she would always glance at the clock. Lying in his arms, she would avert her face slightly and look at the black clock radio by the head of the bed. In those days, clock radios didn't have lighted digital displays but little numbered panels that would flip over with a tiny click. When she looked at the clock, a train would pass the window. It was strange, whenever she looked at the clock, without fail there would be the sound of a train going by. It was like a predestined conditioned reflex, she would look, a train would go by. She was checking the clock to make sure it was not time for her 4-year-old daughter to be coming home from kindergarten. He had happened to catch a glimpse of the girl exactly once. She seemed to be a sweet little child. That was the only impression she left him with. He had never seen the opera-loving husband who worked for a travel bureau. Fortunately. It was an afternoon in May when she first asked him about his talking to himself. She had cried that day, again. And then they had made love, again. He couldn't recall what had made her cry. She had probably just felt like crying. He sometimes wondered if she had become involved with him just so that she could cry in someone's arms. Maybe she can't cry alone, and that's why she needs me. That day she locked the door, closed the curtains, and brought the telephone next to the bed. Then they joined their bodies. Gently, quietly, as always. The doorbell rang, but she ignored it. It seemed not to startle her at all. She shook her head as if to say, never mind, it's nothing. The bell rang several more times, but soon the person gave up and went away. Just as she had said, it was nothing. Maybe a salesman. But how could she know? He wondered. A train rumbled by now and then. A piano sounded in the distance. He vaguely recognized the melody. He had heard it once, long ago, in music class, but he couldn't recall it exactly. A vegetable seller's truck clattered by out front. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and he came, with the utmost gentleness. He went to the bathroom for a shower. When he came back drying himself with a bath towel, he found her lying face down in bed with her eyes closed. He sat down next to her and, as always, caressed her back as he let his eyes wander over the titles of the opera records. Soon she left the bed, got properly dressed, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. It was a short time later that she asked him, "Is that an old habit, the way you talk to yourself like that?" "Like what?" She had taken him off guard. "You mean, while we're—" No. Not then. Just any time. Like, when you're taking a shower, or when I'm in the kitchen and you're by yourself, reading the newspaper kind of thing. "I had no idea," he said, shaking his head. "I never noticed. I talk to myself." "You do?" "Really," she said, toying with his lighter. "It's not that I don't believe you," he said, the discomfort of it affecting his voice. He put a cigarette in his mouth, took the lighter from her hand, and used it to light up. He had started smoking 7 Stars a short time earlier. It was her husband's brand. He had always smoked Hope Regulars. Not that she had asked him to switch to her husband's brand, he had thought of taking the precaution himself. It would just make things easier, he had decided. Like on the TV melodramas. "I used to talk to myself a lot, too," she said. "When I was little." "Oh, really?" "But my mother made me stop. A young lady does not talk to herself," she used to say. And whenever I did it, she got so angry. She'd lock me in a closet, which, for me, was about the scariest place I could imagine, all dark and moldy smelling. Sometimes she'd smack me on the knees with a ruler. It worked. And it didn't take very long. I stopped talking to myself, completely. Not a word. After a while, I couldn't have done it if I had wanted to. He couldn't think of anything to say to this, and so he said nothing. She bit her lip. "Even now," she said, "if I feel I'm about to say something, I just swallow my words. It's like a reflex. Because I got yelled at so much when I was little. But, I don't know, what's so bad about talking to yourself? It's natural. It's just words coming out of your mouth. If my mother were still alive, I almost think I'd ask her, what's so bad about talking to yourself? She's dead. Aha. But I wish I had gotten it straight with her. I wish I had asked her, why did you do that to me?" She was playing with her coffee spoon. She glanced at the clock on the wall. The moment she did that, a train went by outside. She waited for the train to pass. Then she said, "I sometimes think that people's hearts are like deep wells. Nobody knows what's at the bottom. All you can do is imagine by what comes floating to the surface every once in a while." Both of them thought about wells for a little while. "What do I talk about when I talk to myself?" he asked. "For example." She said, slowly shaking her head a few times, almost as if she were discreetly testing the range of movement of her neck. "Well, there's airplanes. Aha. You know. They fly through the sky." He laughed. "Why would I talk to myself about airplanes, of all things?" She laughed, too. And then, using her index fingers, she measured the length of an imaginary object in the air. This was a habit of hers. One that he had picked up. "You pronounce your words so clearly, too. Are you sure you don't remember talking to yourself?" "I don't remember a thing." She picked up the ballpoint pen lying on the table and played with it for a few seconds, but then she looked at the clock again. It had done its job. In the 5 minutes since her last look, it had advanced 5 minutes worth. You talk to yourself as if you were reciting poetry. A hint of red came into her face as she said this. He found this odd. Why should my talking to myself make her turn red? He tried out the words in rhythm. I talk to myself / almost as if / I were reciting / p try. She picked up the pen again. It was a yellow plastic ballpoint pen with a logo marking the 10th anniversary of a certain bank branch. He pointed at the pen and said, "Next time you hear me talking to myself, take down what I say, will you?" She stared straight into his eyes. "You really want to know?" He nodded. She took a piece of notepaper and started writing something on it. She wrote slowly, but she kept the pen moving, never once resting or getting stuck for a word. Chin in hand, he looked at her long eyelashes the whole time. She would blink once every few seconds at irregular intervals. The longer he looked at them, these lashes which, until a few moments ago, had been wet with tears, the less he understood. What did his sleeping with her really mean? A strange sense of loss overtook him, as if one part of a complex system had been stretched and stretched until it became terribly simple. I might never be able to go anywhere else again. When this thought came to him, the horror of it was almost more than he could bear. His being, his very self, was going to melt away. Yes, it was true, he was as young as newly formed mud, and he talked to himself as if reciting poetry. She stopped writing and thrust the paper toward him across the table. He reached out and took it from her. In the kitchen, the afterimage of some great thing was holding its breath. He often felt the presence of this afterimage when he was with her, the afterimage of a thing that had been lost. Something of which he had no memory. "I know it all by heart," she said. "This is what you said to yourself about airplanes." He read the words aloud, airplane airplane flying on the airplane flying but still, though it flew the airplanes the sky. All of this. He was stunned. The whole thing, she said. Incredible. I can't believe I said all this to myself and don't remember any of it. She gave her lower lip a little bite and flashed a tiny smile. You did, though, just like that. He let out a sigh. This is too weird. I've never once thought about airplanes. I have absolutely no memory of this. Why, all of a sudden, would an airplane come popping out? I don't know, but that is exactly what you were saying before in the shower. You may not have been thinking about airplanes, but somewhere deep in a forest, far away, your heart was thinking about them. Who knows? Maybe somewhere deep in a forest I was making an airplane. With a small thunk, she set the ballpoint pen on the table, then raised her eyes and stared at him. They remained silent for some time. The coffee in their cups clouded up and grew cold. The earth turned on its axis while the moon imperceptibly shifted the force of gravity and turned the tides. Time flowed on in silence, and trains passed over the rails. He and she were thinking about the very same thing, an airplane. The airplane that his heart was making deep in the forest. How big it was, and its shape, and the color of its paint, and where it was going, and who would board it. They thought about the airplane that was waiting for someone deep in the forest. She cried again soon after that. This was the very first time that she had cried twice in the same day. It was also the last. It was a special thing for her. He reached across the table and touched her hair. There was something tremendously real about the way it felt. Like life itself, it was hard and smooth, and far away. Yes, he thought, in those days, I used to talk to myself as if reciting poetry. Translated by J. Rubin.